Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before I introduce our guest speaker for this evening, I'd like to acknowledge several individuals who made this evening a possibility. And at the top of the list, I would like to thank our principal of Assumption University, Richard Corneille, for his direction, insight, and steady support over the past few months. As you know, organizing a guest lecture of this magnitude and of this caliber doesn't happen overnight, so thank you to Richard. Also, I'd like to thank our team at Assumption University with Cecile Bertrand, Maura Belmore, and Jessica Lemon, who is our paparazzi for this evening. Thank you. They've been tremendous support over the past few months, and their attention to detail is nothing short of impressive, so I thank them. I also like to thank Taylor Campbell, who is going to be recording this evening's lecture and putting it up on our Assumption University YouTube channel later on. Thank you for doing that. And I also like to thank the Jaroslavsky Foundation and the Basilian Fathers for supporting me in my role as chair. I'm also grateful to President Alan Wildeman and the Office of the Registrars for allowing us use of this facility. We're very fortunate to have it. Tonight's lecture is entitled The Future of Islam and Muslim-West Relations. What does it matter? I'm very honored to be introducing Dr. John Esposito, who will be leading this lecture. In addition to being a distinguished and internationally renowned scholar, Dr. Esposito is regarded as one of the world's leading scholars of Islam. He is a university professor of religion, international affairs, and Islamic studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He was also the founding director of the Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, again at Georgetown. In addition to his distinguished teaching career, Dr. Esposito is a prolific author of, get this, over 50 books, including Islam, the Straight Path, which I believe it's in its 5th edition right now, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, Who Speaks for Islam, Islamophobia, The Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century, and What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And fortunately, we have some of them available this evening. I'm not going to go through all 50, unless you want me to. Dr. Esposito also served as the editor for several major reference works in the field, and actually most of them I included in my doctoral work, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Islamic World, the Oxford History of Islam, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, all Oxford, which is considered the top of the field. Sorry to anybody from Cambridge here. His teaching and prolific publication records have not stopped Dr. Esposito from providing public service to the profession, the community, and the various countries. During his career, he has served as the president of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies, the president of the American Academy of Religion, and the president of the Middle East Studies Association. He has also been a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders, the EC European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization, and a senior scientist for the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. He is also an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations. He has served as a consultant for the U.S. Department of State and other agencies both in Europe and Asia. He has also served as a consultant for corporations, universities, and media networks. And on that note of media networks, Dr. Esposito has been interviewed and written countless articles and newspaper articles for several magazines and media around the globe, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, the Times of London, and maybe if he's lucky, the Windsor Star. I don't know. But in addition, last point, Dr. Esposito is also recipient of several honorary doctorates, including one from our sister institution, the University of St. Michael's in Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. John Esposito.
And thank you for that very generous introduction. For those of you who are students, in recent years I've taken to encourage you to say something that is absolutely true, but it makes me sound like I'm humble, and then when you see my ego, it'll offset it. I am the oldest of the 3 boys in my family and the least intelligent, and the least likely to succeed at anything. But in my early life, just by way of background, because of comments I'll make, I'll refer to my early life. Normally I don't get into that. I was raised Catholic. I was a Capuchin Franciscan for quite a few years, not ordained, and was a young Catholic theologian during Vatican II. I only began to study Islam in the late 60s and early 70s. I'll just make a couple of comments so that I can contextualize what I want to say. When I got into the field and finished my degree in the early 70s, there was one job in Islam in the entire United States. The reason why many of us were able to get jobs was the program at Temple, we trained in 3 religions. I majored in Islam, I minored in Hinduism and Buddhism. What they hired me to do is to teach everything but Islam. It wasn't that they didn't want me to teach Islam. They wanted me to teach world religions. I did Hinduism and Buddhism. It wasn't until the Iranian Revolution that, in fact, the field that I was in took any notice. I owe my career and my first Lexus to the Ayatollah Khomeini. That's literally true. And I owe my coupe to bin Laden, but that's sad. The reality of it is at that time that Islam was not only invisible in colleges and universities, but it was also invisible in academia, in the sense that academic organizations, the American Academy of Religion, representing the study of religion globally, and the largest organization doing it, had no coverage of Islam. Diplomats who were going to the Muslim world, there was no, people did not see any need to deal with the question of religion and culture in those days. The basic approach at that time was captured in a book dealing with religion in America that was called Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, full stop. And indeed, what was groundbreaking was that Catholic was included. It was like the first time you had this major recognition. It's against that background then, and that we then get the Iranian Revolution, and it's against that background that people have an encounter with Islam. Okay? So, for example, in the United States, when we had the hijacking, not hijacking, I'm sorry, the takeover of the embassy, you had a situation where on the very popular morning news show, the Today Show, Tom Brokaw opened it up, and we're going to get a report now in terms of the hostages, but he began by saying, let me tell you something about Islam. There's a religion called Islam. It's the second largest of the world's religions. It has a prophet named Muhammad, and it has a book called the Quran. Now, to state that so basic, this basic knowledge, in a country that feels that it has a good educational system, says something about where we were. Because for anybody in America who had been traveling overseas in other countries, if somebody never heard of the word Bible, Jesus, you'd wonder, are they educated? Are they civilized? Okay, so against that background, we then begin to deal with how Islam is perceived, let alone how Islam is actually unfolding and engaging other faiths as well as countries, okay? And so I wanted to get that out there. Now, as I begin, let me point out that the 2 largest religions in the world and the 2 global religions are basically Islam and Christianity. Islam, you have 1.6, 1.7 billion, and Christians 2.3. And it was last year or the year before that the Vatican made a statement that there were more Muslims than there were Catholics, which raised in my tradition was a big thing for the Vatican to step forward. On the other hand, the Vatican's taken a lot of steps forward under the current Pope, thank God. Okay, so the importance then of the encounter of Islam and of Christianity is not only of religious import, it's of political import, both domestic politics and international politics. Domestically, it has a good deal to do with the rise of Islamophobia, anti-Islam and anti-Muslim acts and behavior, from simply hate speech to hate crimes, but also the civil liberties of Muslims and the threatening of civil liberties of Muslims. Fortunately, in America, we've made it very clear that we operate far more broadly. We now, of course, also have a great bias against immigrants. Many of them are Muslims, but hey, if you're Hispanic, you can come along. If you're Mexican, under the current president, all of that will be out there. This is being recorded. This will be very interesting. I wonder if I'll get back into the U.S. Okay, so let me begin then by talking about, having made the comment about Iran, let me begin by then jumping to 9/11. Against the background of Iran, and after Iran also, hijackings and some attacks on embassies by militant groups, you then had 9/11. For people in the U.S., but I'd also say fairly globally, certainly in Europe, I can't speak about Canada, but for the U.S. and for Europe, because they also were victims, direct victims, 9/11 was just a shattering experience. And it was interesting to me because it was a shattering experience, but the reality of it is that as tragic and terrible as it was in terms of the numbers of people who were killed, one can think of the vast numbers of people where we're talking about millions of people being killed, and that sense of not quite the same proportionality. Americans were very vulnerable to the attack because we fought all our wars overseas, other than the attack on Pearl Harbor, which for mainland Americans, it was tragic, but it wasn't seen as getting at, as it were, coming into the heart of America. For many, this was an unbelievable experience. I traveled for many months rather than going overseas across America speaking, and it was amazing, no matter where I was in America, the American flags that were out there, the concern of people, the involvement of people. But what 9/11 also signaled, and what ratcheted it up, was a fear of a global terrorism now. That is, you had a global terrorist movement. It wasn't that you had a terrorist movement that operated just in Egypt or a terrorist movement that operated just in Algeria. You now saw this global movement and the agenda of that movement, and also the ability for mass media with globalization increasingly of communications to cover this. Do I want to say old enough? I don't think so. I'm mature enough, that's better. I am mature enough to say that I can remember going to the movies during the Second World War or even during the Korean War, and you'd go to the movies and you'd see a movie, but then you would see the news. But the news was usually a week old because the communication came over here. Now we have the blessing of being able to have our breakfast and watch, the tragedies taking place. What happens when you have that kind of coverage is then you get into the question of experience. Now, I'm going to use, my analogy's limp, but I'll just start with some. I was raised in a totally Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn. For as far as I could walk, see, we were Italians and we were Catholic. So I don't worry about dying and going to heaven because I know what heaven will be like, okay? On the other hand, when I then came out of that cocoon, I had to deal with a lot of other ethnic groups. The danger when I look back was that if I met one or two people of a certain ethnic group and I was impressed with them, I thought everybody was like that. And if I wasn't impressed with them, I thought, well, that's the way they are, And you'd have that kind of generalization. I saw it when I brought my wife home. She wasn't my wife at the time, the woman that I was dating. And I brought her home to meet my parents. My wife was and is still a beautiful blonde, blue eyes. I married her, obviously, for her mind, but as I watched her walk off the bus, I thought, there's a woman with a great mind. I want to meet her, marry her. But I remember when I brought her home, she had a black dress, no makeup, hair pulled back, and that's what we do when we mourn traditionally Italians. We might do it for a month like that. And so after it, I said, I don't understand what was going on. I said, what was the... She said, well, I didn't know how your parents would accept me. And my parents were like very warm, and they adopted her as the daughter that they never had. But she said, I said, well, then why did you feel that way? She said, well, the only Italians I knew, the people that lived next door to my parents. And they're nice, but they're loud, they're kind of coarse. I assured her that they were probably Irish or some other group because I come from a tradition of popes, opera, and culture. So it couldn't be that, and mafia is not to be associated, with my group. But that generalization. So for many Americans who had never engaged Islam, with the Iranian Revolution, they saw people every day saying death to America. And for many, they thought that was all of Iran turning out, and this must be what Muslims are like. Then you get bin Laden, and you get the attacks, and that threat gets ratcheted up in terms of magnitude by the media. And let me just give you some examples in terms of the media. There's a group called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, for students who want to look it up, M-E-D-I-A-T-E-N-O-R, okay? Media Tenor monitors, they're based in Europe. They monitor American and European media every day. They had 200 people doing it 7 days a week. I think they've cut a few, but it's a mega outfit. They did a study from 2001 to 2011, and they took a look at 975,000 pieces of media, 975,000 pieces of media. And they looked at all that media and said, where do we see Islam and Muslims covered? You know, what do the percentages look like? 2001, 2% of the coverage was extremism, 0.1% were the vast number of Muslims in the world with all the things that they do, achieve, etc. So 2%, 0.1. 10 years later, the 2% jumps to 25%. Okay? That can be understandable, increased terrorism, etc. The other side remains at 0.1%. So now you have a magnitude of a breach here in terms of the numbers. I mean, if you think about it, for example, ISIS is a threat, okay? But how many people have ever been, what are the numbers that we've given for ISIS historically? Max 30,000, let's say maybe 40,000 in the whole world. But it's the nature of terrorism that means you can be small in number, but to be feared, you know? It's not, because it's not conventional warfare, okay? In 2015, 2016, a report came out in which they looked at the US, the UK, and Germany. They had a broader look also, but just to take those three, US, UK, and Germany, 80% of the media coverage was on extremism. When individuals were featured, they were either terrorists or warlords, most of them. 50% of the mainstream stuff was on the negative side. So you think about the impact of media for many people. Now, that's mass media. For some of us who are older, we tend to think that mass media is the most important place to get information. It's not, in terms of impact. It's social media. Whereas 10 or 15 years ago, it was mass media would make a story and then social media would pick it up. It's now the reverse. And I've seen this in my own situation dealing with, for example, the O'Reilly show, et cetera, where something goes viral on the internet, then the TV channels, pick it up. Now, if you look at social media, two studies that have been done in the United States that look at a 10-year period, looking at IRS returns, okay, of monies going from establishment philanthropies, who may or may not, they give money to a lot of outfits, whether or not they knew the nature of the outfits they were giving their money to. But the point is, more than $200 million went to far-right, anti-immigrant, and anti-Muslim groups. And many of them have names like Family Security. I've been attacked on that one. What's the other one? Pajama Media. I mean, they sound very innocuous. You get to others outfits like Jihad Watch, that's different. So this is really a kind of industry, of a group of people and their response. If you then look at the other influence in terms of the issue of, if you will, Christian-Muslim relations, both domestically and internationally, but from the U.S. side, the U.S.'s role, take a look at when do we usually wind up with the biggest issue or the biggest problem. It's presidential elections. 2008, 2012, and more recently 2016. Okay? The presidential elections, when we actually look at those in terms of what are the things that cause the numbers to go up, the negative numbers. It's that, and also things like the invasion of Iraq. In other words, we're at war with Iraq. And we being the UK, the US, and therefore from the UK and the US's attitude, that's the world that counts, okay? All right. In that context, one then really gets a sense of, what is really sort of taking place, okay? You've got a magnitude of funds and money. First of all, you've got events that indeed are dangerous, okay? Should have zero tolerance. But when you're trying to understand, okay, who these people are and to what extent do they represent the religion that they say they represent, you need to know their numbers, you need to know what the faith teaches. One of the examples I give is, for example, if you look at Northern Ireland, and the troubles in Northern Ireland. You had Catholic and Protestant going against each other. A lot of it had to do with history, politics, and socioeconomics, and a sense of identity where people identify themselves as Catholic or Protestant, regardless of whether or not they actually practice their faith. But for some, it was seen as a Catholic and Protestant thing, And that kind of reality needs to be transferred when we look at another situation, which then gets magnified because you have so many more Muslims in the world and so many more Muslim countries. So I just want to check this so I can move ahead. So let me talk about concretely about how Muslims globally view the West and how the West views Muslims. One of the things that we've gotten as a source in the last 10 or 15 years, which I think is very valuable, is our ability to get beyond the battle of the experts. The battle of the experts you see all the time. When it used to be with regard to the cigarette companies, they'd have somebody with a PhD coming out and saying, it doesn't kill you. Somebody else with a PhD would say, it killed you. The two could have been going to the same university. I actually gave this example in the Gulf, and I used Cornell as an example. I can't tell you, I had 3 people from Cornell come up to me after it, upset that I mentioned their university, so I'm not concretizing this example. So we've got the cigarette industry, but when you get into the Middle East and Islam, okay, who do you believe? You have people with PhDs, and not just PhDs, people who may have published a lot of books on both sides, people who've been out in the Muslim world, okay, and they have sometimes diametrically opposed positions. For example, those of you that know the field, I would be, not diametrically, I used to admire this man's scholarship, but his scholarship of the last 30 or so years, I disagree with Bernard Lewis, for example. Or if you talk about somebody like Daniel Pipes, there are other people. So, who do you believe when you're looking at that? Plus, what are the kind of questions that we experts are asked? We're asked questions that are, for example, well, how do the people in Iraq feel about us? To which the response should be, how the hell do I know? I mean, I know what some Iraqis think, or, some Pakistanis. I've been in many parts of Pakistan. I've gone there for years. So there's a level of how do we know that when we say people think a certain way, that we have hard evidence about the numbers of people, and what they think. The Gallup World Poll was done from 2001 to 2007. And then more recently, you have the Pew Foundation has done a lot of work on this. So if you go to Pew website or Gallup's website and you want to get data on almost anything, how do Muslims think about this or that, and, Muslim-West relations, et cetera, you can go to it. What was interesting about the Gallup work, it was the first massive look at the whole world. They had a world poll, and within it, they looked at 35, sometimes 40 Muslim countries. So they teased out those countries and looked at certain specific questions, not the global world questions that everybody was answering, including Muslims, like how do you feel about your life, how do you feel about kind of just your government, got more specific. And what do we find? On the one hand, we were told after 9/11, they hate who we are. They hate us for who we are. We're liberal, we're democratic, we believe in human rights, we believe in women's rights, etc. Well, there's a lot of that good, but we're not exactly totally there. But if you look at the hard data, you find that majorities of Muslims across the world, okay, during that period, okay, were saying they admired the West for its sense of governance, democratization, human rights, freedoms. When asked if you could write a constitution, what are the kinds of things that you want to see there? It had to do with human rights and freedoms. Why? Because so many countries in the Muslim world, and there are other countries like this too, are not just developing countries, they have authoritarian regimes. So people are living in an authoritarian regime that is repressive, where their human rights are stifled, where they really don't have the kinds of freedoms that we enjoy in other parts of the world. And when asked what they would want for themselves, it was the same stuff and similar. That is, they want good economic situation, good educational system for their kids and family. They want security, and they want good relations with the West. When asked what they did not like about the West, they mentioned the fact that Islam and Muslims are the way they are seen, that in fact Muslim life and Arab life is seen as cheap or less than the lives of others. But you could think about how one would see that in terms of the magnitude of warfare and violence, the fact that the American government knows, as we should have known, every American that died in Iraq and Afghanistan and or that were wounded. But when asked about the casualties on the other side, the Secretary of Defense would say, we just don't have those numbers. On the other hand, when others would do a major study, Johns Hopkins did a major study, an outfit there, talking about the numbers killed, a couple 100,000. Immediately, the response of somebody like Rumsfeld or his representative was, that's inaccurate. Okay. Now, so you're talking about that question of, if you will, in terms of magnitude. What's interesting is that the other part that was said, because this ties into more recent events, what was the concern? with regard to the West. The concern with regard to the West was that majorities believed that the West was not serious about the promotion of democracy in the Muslim world, and that the West would not honor free and fair elections, no matter what they said. Well, you know, where did that come from? The fact is, our relationship has always been with authoritarian regimes, with others too, but with the major authoritarian regimes in the region. And indeed, after the so-called Arab Spring, and after you had a coup in Egypt, the EU and the US have gone back to being convinced that the issue, the primary concern should be national interest, and national interest requires securitization of the state. Securitization of the state, meaning you need to feel that these states, your allies, are secure. Therefore, even if they're authoritarian, you support them because they have a large army, security people, etc., and can therefore keep things in check in terms of what you believe your interests are. Okay, and that's part of the tension that we have. I mean, that is that just as when you want to understand Islam and events in the Muslim world, there's a difference sometimes between stated ideals and reality. The same thing could be said of Western governments. The way you see that perception, I wish I had the statistic. I forgot I was going to be lecturing in Canada tonight. It was literally the equivalent. They were asked a question like, I think it was maybe Kuwaitis, were asked their attitude with regard to the US and the UK, you know, the negative attitude, very high. Their attitude towards Canada, and we call Canada the United States without its foreign policy, was like about 1% had a negative attitude. I mean, you had this incredible, you know, you could see that kind of, a disparate reality that one was dealing with. So, you know, where do we go from here? And please feel free in the Q&A if you want to ask me to talk more about terrorism, Sharia, etc. Feel free to do that. But I don't want to get into all of that right now. Where we are today, number one, is we need to get beyond the extent to which too often, and this is particularly true in Europe and the US in recent years, even before, but very much in years, the far right and anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim folks are playing an ascendant role. Now, it may be nice to say that Geert Wilders didn't win in the Netherlands, but the fact is he's got the second most important political party. And Le Pen didn't win, but the fact is she's got an important party. And Macron, who everybody saw as a great liberator, his numbers are really bad negatively. So potentially you can have that, that situation. The fact is that even in a country like Norway, you had somebody who in fact was a Christian terrorist, but we never say that. They didn't call him a terrorist, nor did they note that he was Christian. And he noted he was Christian, who killed something like 80 people, that he was influenced in his thought, and he quotes them throughout this huge volume that he wrote, European and American Islamophobes, anti-Muslim people. I'm proud to say that my center and myself had a whole page devoted to us, and he attacked us, which is nice. If he liked us, that would have been a real issue. But the reality of it is that we need to move beyond the stereotyping and deal with the realities of what we're dealing with. Therefore, for example, when you see terrorist groups, I can say this right now, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda will appeal to religion to legitimate, mobilize, recruit in the region. They will appeal to religion. They have a distorted notion of religion, and they will use it, okay? They do not represent, by any of the data that we have, the vast majority of Muslims, but they do take that kind of position. The difficulty is that when you deal with a situation where 50% of Americans, roughly, and I don't have the stats on Canada for this, but about 50% for years have said they don't know a Muslim. And even said things like, I don't know much about Islam, I should, but they don't pick a book up. We do find a big difference between younger generation and older generation. Older generation was far more raised in a white world. So if you look at Europe, when Europe says we need to go, when they're reacting to the right, we need to get back to our values, what are they talking about? They don't want to say we need to get back to a point where everybody's white, speaks Danish if it's Denmark, has their families have come here for hundreds of years, is Christian or secular, to the extent that they've gone. So it's that kind of dealing with what our realities are. But at the same time, we need to take a look at Muslims close to home. Who are the Muslims in Europe? Who are the Muslims in Canada? Who are the Muslims in America? Where are the vast majority, and we have studies on this, where are the vast majorities to be found? In a place like America, Muslims are now integrated educationally, politically, economically, in very leadership positions. Muslims are the second of religious groups, the second most educated after American Jews, significantly higher than others, have the highest number of youth, significantly more than 10% higher than non-Muslim youth going to colleges and universities. I mean, we have all of that. Their answer on pluralistic questions are very pluralistic, far more pluralistic than many that live in Muslim countries. Okay? Because among the problems is that when you're living in Muslim countries, you have, in many countries, not all, authoritarian regimes. They tend to control newspapers, speech, and they control and use religion. In other words, they control who gets to be the religious leaders, the top religious leaders, and even the religious messages. In countries like Egypt and others, the sermons are given from on high to the imams, what they are to say, what they are not to say. A country like Saudi Arabia relies on its ultra-conservative religious clergy for its legitimacy, and vice versa. You have a very cozy relationship. In America and in Europe, you have a much different situation in terms of Muslims and the way that they operate. So what's the challenge today? The big challenge to me in the 21st century, in a couple of my books, I have it actually in the title. To me, the big challenge is the issue of pluralism, political pluralism and religious pluralism. Okay? And before I forget, just to put something in parentheses for you in terms of the way things work, President Obama did not go to a mosque in America until his second term and the last year. Why? He went to mosques in Europe, etc. Because prominent people and a network of people were insisting that he was actually a Muslim and that he was trying to, ultimately was going to infiltrate and bring about Sharia. I said to somebody, my idea of the ideal interview of President Obama would to be go on one of the night shows, and they'd say, so, Mr. President, how does it feel to be an ex-president? What are you doing? And have him begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. That would just drive the Islamophobes right off the wall. Okay? But now you take a look at American politics. Okay? Our current president has said Islam hates us. He hasn't said Muslim extremists hate us. He said Islam hates us. And when asked, well, you know what? What do we know? How many? Oh, lots and lots of them. He's called for a Muslim ban. Not a ban on extremists and terrorists, a Muslim ban. Senior members of his government in the cabinet and in other senior positions, a number of them, however talented and diverse they are, so this is not a knock at them in terms of their accomplishments or abilities. A General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of State, for example, Mr. Tillerson. But these folks in recent years, not just during this administration, but in recent years, have said Islam is not a religion, number one. That's an incredible statement to make. I mean, how do you even state that rationally and empirically? It's not a religion. It's a political ideology, and a dangerous political ideology. Yes, extremist Muslims practice an extremist. But you say it's not a religion, okay? That means you take a swipe at the mainstream. It's a dangerous ideology, and therefore we need to address it. Well, then you know what it means when you say address it, okay? And you see the temperament that we're living in if you look at not the statements of Mattis and Tillerson, but if you look at the statements of the president. And the history of most nations is you look at what the head of the nation says. If we look at Germany, we do want to know what Angela Merkel says. Okay, so the challenge is pluralism. Now, what does that really mean? It means that, for example, that we come to recognize in Canada and the United States that we do not just have a Judeo-Christian tradition, we have a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And we also recognize other religions, but in terms of the whole notion of the Judeo-Christian heritage, I mean, the fact is, Christians, there was never a Judeo-Christian tradition for centuries. Christians did not talk about a Judeo-Christian tradition. No. We marginalized and persecuted Jews. Post-World War II, the notion of Judeo-Christian came about, okay? And Christians were able to say that, those that wanted to advocate it, because they could look back and say, We've got the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. But even the way we refer to it says something, Old Testament, New Testament, okay? I remember having a Jewish professor who eventually went to Harvard, but he was interviewing for a job at Holy Cross, and I think he'd been teaching at Princeton. And he said the worst thing he did, this is quite a few years ago, is that he changed the course to Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. He said nobody was taking it because they didn't know what he was teaching. He said as soon as I put Old Testament again, I started to get the undergraduates coming in. Okay, so it's a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, and then that forces us to take a look and realize that what Jews, Christians, and Muslims share is a common attitude. Not that there aren't differences, but a common theological, historical, theological relationship in terms of recognition of the one God, recognition of revelation and prophets, and indeed, Muslims take it one step further, accepting, on the one hand, the idea that Muhammad is the last of the prophets, but accepting the biblical prophets. And as some of you know, or you may have heard, Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than in the New Testament. Whole areas of the Quran are devoted to Jesus. A common Muslim name is Isa, Jesus, and Musa, Moses. I have a Muslim friend who has a large family, 2 sons, Isa, etc. Okay? Belief in moral accountability, social justice, many of certainly in the teachings of Jesus and in many of the biblical prophets, and a sense of moral responsibility and accountability in terms of this life and the next life. Okay? We have those differences. If we don't move to the pluralistic side of things, though, then the question becomes that we don't recognize the equality of citizens. The issue of Christians and their equality in the Muslim world is increasingly an issue. So is the issue, in the reverse sense, of Muslims and their civil liberties in Europe and in North America. It's not just a question of getting a job in the society. It's a question of whether or not you have the same civil liberties as everyone else. Which brings me to my 2 last points. Don't say that means pluralism and tolerance. Tolerance is no longer acceptable. Tolerance came from and meant I tolerate your existence. In the old days, when somebody was tolerant of the other, it didn't mean that you necessarily wanted to talk with them, that you necessarily even wanted to hire them, that you wanted them to be moving into your neighborhood, that you saw them and were concerned about the equal rights. You might feel that they had rights to existence, right to hold jobs, but certain jobs, right to freedoms, but certain freedoms. We need to actually develop a notion, if we want to talk about the word tolerance, which is based on mutual understanding and respect. You can't have respect for people unless you understand them. Okay? Now, if you can't, then at least minimally it ought to be that part of citizenship is, okay, I don't know much about your faith, but it doesn't mean because I don't know it, that I can do X or Y. If we don't move to that, what's happening is we're developing a new sense of the other. When I grew up, and when my dad and his family grew up, the other were Italians, Germans, ethnic Catholics. I mean, that was just a reality. In World War II, when my father was going to a job in New York, it was, basically no blacks, no Jews, no Catholics. And in fact, the way you handled it was to call us all papist. But the implication was that everybody was somehow marching with the Pope, when in fact many ethnic Catholics, even in those days, didn't practice their faith. Or did it minimally. They were sort of Easter Catholics, etc. So that becomes really important, this notion of broadening our sense of some kind of pluralism and tolerance, but it has to be a redefining of tolerance. This is just a silly example, but, oh, geez, I'm going to say this stuff. Okay, so what? I didn't have dinner, so we'll attribute it to the fact that I'm flipping out. I met somebody today, and we were talking about pluralism and tolerance. And I talked about how when I grew up, in my father's generation, to get married, an acceptable marriage was to marry an Italian. It wasn't just a Catholic, okay? So, for example, in my family, when you have my uncle marry an Irish woman, that was an issue. And I remember Grandma kind of indicating once that at a holiday, pointing out that my aunt, okay, was drinking and liked to drink. Now, my uncle did too, but my uncle was a man, and he was, and then the question of, in my generation, the question was, and most people would ask, well, did the boys all marry, maybe not ethnically the same person, but certainly a Catholic person? Now we are more and more being forced within our religious traditions to be more pluralistic. You see at times the real tension within forms of Protestantism, from ultra-conservative to liberal. You see it in the Catholic Church. You see it in the fact that, in fact, ultra-conservative Catholics, many of them, are in the same position both religiously and politically as ultra-conservative evangelicals. And I'm not saying all evangelicals. You notice the way I'm framing it, okay? So we've got that thing not only across religions, but within religions. More and more, we're more and more going into the othering, rather than realizing if there is a God, even if you don't want to accept God, but let's say for those of us that are believers, if there is a God and God is the creator and we're creation, okay, then all of creation is interconnected. If God is the creator of all of us. I mean, it's this, and this isn't just like pie in the sky theology, not that all theology is pie in the sky, but I was going for a PhD in theology, and I found I was falling asleep a lot when I was reading the books, and I had an epiphany, like, should I do this as a field? I think I really want to do this, but if I fall asleep a good deal of the time, what does it mean? Because now we're much more into and seeing the interconnection of religion with society and politics. When I was a theologian, even people that like me would say, the engineers, "Oh, you're a theologian, how nice." It wasn't like they wanted to have a conversation about what I did. It was sort of like, you're curious. You're not a priest, you're a theologian. I mean, why would you do that, So we have to move away from this constant othering, which is now occurring across divides, across ethnic groups, across religions. I did a conference in Europe on Islamophobia, and a woman from Poland got up and said, the good news is, and she meant it sarcastically, the good news is we have very few Muslims in Poland. The bad news is Poland is very Islamophobic. If you do studies in people's attitudes towards Islam and Muslims, you would think we had a lot of Muslims in the country. Okay? I mean, in other words, that far-right sentiment is very far-right, both politically, but also it gets into all the others, and defining out, who should be there. The next thing is just to end on is foreign policy in Muslim-West relations. What we have found is that anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism is actually not because of who we are, but what we do. Who we are, but what we do. The gripe is colonialism. The gripe is neocolonialism. The gripe is that one can say you're coming in to liberate and democratize a country like Iraq, and then you occupy it. And how do we know that it's an occupation? Not only the massive presence of military, but the fact that it emerges that we already knew who we wanted to see be president, Ahmad Shalabi, an Iraqi living in the United States. The whole idea was, how do we get him in, as that person? When you look at, again, and the magnitude of the numbers of people who then see their country destroyed, however different they are. I can remember giving a talk on Iraq, and it was at a very sensitive time. And it was in the U.S., and somebody got up and said, I'm an Iraqi Christian, who had to leave Iraq. And I thought for sure we were going to get into this situation where it was like, really squaring off. And in fact, what he was saying is, a real part of his problem was not simply that there were Muslim extremists that were causing him problems. It was that in the city, that his business, everything, had basically been destroyed. So part of it is that in terms of Muslim-West relations, we have to be far more sensitive and develop a foreign policy which is very concerned about the fight against extremism and terrorism, but realizes that it's not primarily religion. One of the great debates in America and Europe, and globally, the big thing is CVE, combating violent extremism. Far more, but that's the biggest thing, because of global terrorism, the fighting. But there's a real division within the U.S., within the EU, within the UN, and I've been in situations in all of those three, speaking and interacting, between those who simply say, oh, well, the real thing is religion. See, that's the easy answer, because then you say, if the real reason is religion, all we have to do is fix Islam. So we got to get the right reformist Muslims and support them. We've got to get, the right grand muftis to make grand statements. At the same time, you're not looking at who are the rulers of the country. Are they authoritarian? What are they doing to their people? And what are they doing to their people? and many of their people seeing that their ruler is being supported militarily and financially by the U.S. government, that in a sense talks with forked tongue, as it were, says one thing, we say one thing, but we don't do it. It was admitted by George Bush. This is not a negative comment about George W. Bush. He made a statement in his second term that said that all American presidents in recent history, his predecessors, and himself in his first term, had practiced democratic exceptionalism in the Middle East. In other words, when we talked about after the fall of the Soviet Union, the promotion of democracy, we even promoted it in Eastern Europe where people were atheists, communists, and we didn't say, oh, well, you really can't get it to take. You got generations that are that. When it came to the Middle East, we went the other way. We went the other way. That is, we just sort of backed off, and we didn't get involved. The danger now is that we do not move forward in a way that says we have to simultaneously be concerned about addressing these terrorists, but we have to look at the root causes of terrorism. What are the political and economic drivers that alienate a small but deadly number of people, and motivate them to become involved in extremist and terrorist groups? If we don't deal with that, but one of the hard things to deal with it is if your allies are primarily authoritarian rulers, then your feeling is going to be, and to say, well, we don't get involved in the domestic side of what's going on. At the same time that we're giving foreign aid, and a foreign aid that may be used not only for outside, but at home, the training, et cetera, there's a disconnect there. And this is not just about sentiment, it's about the realities on the ground. In fact, in post-Arab Spring, many, not all, of the Gulf states and their rulers have been more and more concerned about their stability and their security. The idea that Egypt could elect a government the fear wasn't that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was going to come to their country. It was that people in their country, you could build up a sense of, look at what can be done. That in fact, you can bring down a government somehow. You can stand up against, a government where the government has military, security forces, secret police, etc. We have to be very careful about, therefore, with governments, how much we get in bed with them in terms of the kind of aid that we give to them, the kinds of arms, and also our association. I mean, a really good example is Yemen. To the extent that we are connected to the policy that's being played out by Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and connected in that we ally with the Saudis, we provide logistical information, etc. Given what's happened, all you have to do is look at human rights reports. The vast majority of victims in Yemen are innocent civilians, and many of them women and children. These are the kind of critical issues that we need to look at. We need to, it seems to me, to bring it to a close, we need to affirm, both in our domestic and our foreign policy, the very values that in North America we say we stand for: liberty, democracy, human rights, equality, freedom. Thank you.